The announcement was the culmination of a 2-year investigation into Benjamin Netanyahu's dealings and imperil his political future just 40 days before he is to stand for re-election. Jerusalem, Israel's Attorney General announced his intention on Thursday to indict Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on charges of bribery, fraud and breach of trust, imperiling Mr. Netanyahu's political future just 40 days before he is to stand for re-election. The decision by Attorney General Avichai Mandelblit was the culmination of a 2-year investigation into Mr. Netanyahu's dealings with wealthy businessmen, including a Hollywood movie producer, Israeli newspaper publishers and the head of the country's largest telecommunications conglomerate. Mr. Netanyahu, who is running for his 4th consecutive term as Prime Minister, is now entitled to a hearing to challenge the charges. If the case proceeds, he would be the first sitting Prime Minister to be indicted. The Attorney General accused Mr. Netanyahu, 69, of trading lucrative official favors for gifts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars including cigars, champagne and jewelry, and for flattering news coverage whose value was incalculable. The Attorney General's decision immediately prompted calls on the left for Mr. Netanyahu to resign. Mr. Netanyahu insisted the prosecution was politically motivated, a scheme cooked up by his left-wing opponents and the news media. "I tell you, citizens of Israel, this whole tower of cards will collapse," he said on national television Thursday night. "I intend to serve as your prime minister for many years. But it depends on you. Not on the commentators and TV studios and articles. It depends only on you." Mr. Netanyahu, who held office for 3 years in the late 1990s before reclaiming power a decade ago, was already facing a surprisingly stiff challenge from a popular former army chief heading into the April 9 election. The charges stem from 3 separate cases. While all 3 involved trading official favors, only one case brought the most serious charge: bribery. In that case, Mr. Netanyahu is accused of aiding the owner of Walla, a leading Israeli news website, in return for the site suppressing or softening coverage about the prime minister and his family and treating his opponents roughly. In one example, Mr. Mandelblit said, Mr. Netanyahu demanded that Walla publish prominently, on Election Day in 2015, his now notorious video warning to right-wing supporters that Arabs were heading to the polls in droves, an appeal for which the Prime Minister later apologized. Mr. Mandelblit said that the evidence showed that Mr. Netanyahu had gone out of his way to aid the company's principal owner, Shaul Elovich, as compensation for the favorable coverage, and that this warranted the charge of bribery, along with charges of fraud and breach of trust. In the second case, the prosecution said that the Hollywood producer Arnon Milchan, an expatriate Israeli, aided by the Australian billionaire James Packer, sent gifts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Prime Minister's residence in Jerusalem, and that Mr. Netanyahu in return promoted legislation that could benefit Mr. Milchan, though it was blocked by the Finance Ministry. In the third, Mr. Netanyahu was accused of discussing with the publisher of Yediot Aharonot, one of Israel's biggest newspapers, the possibility of a deal for favorable coverage. He would press a competing newspaper, Israel Hayom, to curtail its free circulation, and in return Yediot Aharonot would treat Mr. Netanyahu more kindly. Israel Hayom is owned by Sheldon Adelson, the American billionaire casino owner who was a devoted supporter of Mr. Netanyahu's. The deal was never completed, investigators said. In the second and third cases, Mr. Mandelblit said that Mr. Netanyahu should be charged with fraud and breach of trust. Mr. Netanyahu remains highly esteemed by his supporters who, despite his flaws, consider him to be the only Israeli politician with the stature and experience to lead a lonely democracy in a hostile region and represent its interests skillfully on the world stage. And he has worked hard to prepare his devoted right-wing followers for this moment, assailing the investigation as a witch hunt choreographed by the news media in cahoots with his enemies on the left. But as an indictment became increasingly certain, he grew more strident and divisive, alienating even some of the right-leaning voters whose support he needs to win another term. That, in turn, has bolstered his leading opponent, Lieutenant Gen. Benny Gantz, the former Army Chief of Staff, and Mr. Gantz's argument that Israel needs a clean, fresh start. "Thank you for the last 10 years, Mr. Gantz has taken to saying, addressing Mr. Netanyahu. We'll take it from here." Mr. Mandelblit's decision could also hamper Mr. Netanyahu even if he does win re-election, by narrowing his options in forming a new governing coalition, and perhaps even sinking his chances of leading it. His conservative Likud party would almost certainly need to join forces with several smaller parties to achieve a majority of at least 61 votes in the 120-seat parliament. His current right-wing and ultra-Orthodox coalition allies have so far pledged to stick with him, at least until formal charges are lodged, but polls show some of them may not be elected.